Hello, I'm going to go out on a limb here and assume that you know what time it is. Because you're here, it must mean it's story time! Yay! And while you do a little happy dance and get really comfortable, I'm going to tell you that this podcast and all of these stories are supported by excellent patrons. So if you would like to become an excellent patron too and support the stories in that way, I would be over the moon happy. Appreciate it a lot, and you can find out all about how to do that on patreon.com/can I tell you a story. And you will get bonus stories and more things. There are already a pile of bonus stories and more things there for you to peruse at your leisure. Sounds very fancy, doesn't it? Peruse at your leisure. Anyway, you can peruse that at your leisure, and in the meantime, let's have a story. I don't remember the photo. I frown as I look at it, pushing my hair out of my face, and the salt breeze keeps blowing it back in. It's black and white, taken on a beach that looks warmer than this one, where the sun isn't out and the wind makes the waves boom and crash, too wild for swimming. In the photograph, we're squinting into the sun, my sister and me, eyes scrunched up, gap-toothed grinning. I remember a different photograph. One we shouldn't have seen, shouldn't have shown our mother, but we didn't know that until much later, when we'd learned what hindsight was. I remember tears, the sinking feeling of betrayal, of feeling responsible for the whispered arguments behind closed doors that escalated into thrown objects hitting the walls, while we cowered in our dark bedroom, pretending to be sleeping. It went on for months, until a day when I stood waiting at the school gate, watching cars pull up and leave again, until there were no more cars, and a teacher came out, coat on, keys in hand. She asked me where my mother was. I didn't know. Nobody ever told kids anything back then. Maybe they still don't. I never had kids of my own to find out if I'd tell them anything real. I like to think I would have, but maybe I would have forgotten how much I thought I understood, the conclusions I drew from conversations spoken over my head. She drove me home, that teacher. I forget her name. I was never in her class. The house was empty. No mother, no sister. Still a father, though, sitting in a chair, staring at nothing I could see. The teacher said, "All right then," and it was clear that nothing ever would be again, but my father nodded, so I said, "Yeah," and she left, saying she'd see me on Monday. But she didn't, because by then, we were gone too. It was the first time I'd ever been on a plane, but watching the ground shrink as the engines strained and my stomach dropped didn't take long to start feeling routine. We never stayed in places for long. I had a string of nannies with names my father couldn't pronounce, and when I grew out of them, tutors who were meant to teach me algebra and economics, but most of them let me read instead of listening. My father worked like work was all he was. Strange to call him mine. He never acted like we belonged as part of a set. Maybe because the other pieces were missing and we'd never be complete. Any time I spoke of my mother or sister, he'd get that same distant look he'd had the day they left, staring at nothing at all. And he never replied to my questions, asking why they were gone, why I wasn't, or where they were now. Eventually, I got old enough to say no, not another flight, not another plane. We had a conversation then, and he told me to choose where I wanted to stop, while I wondered if I'd ever known that his eyes were grey. For a minute, I thought that no was the magic word I could have said in any of those wandering years to stop my father's perpetual restlessness. But it wasn't. I was just old enough now to get off that particular ride. "Edinburgh," I said, though I remembered almost nothing of the place. He looked away, and his assistant took care of the rest. A week later I had a set of keys in my hand, and I got to the airport too early and looked at all the people going places and tried to feel like I was one of them. The apartment was nice, but a month later I sold it and rented a room in a boarding house where I could hear other people's lives through the walls, and I didn't feel so alone. I never did get around to telling my father I'd moved. I kicked around town in the rain and the fog, the high white sky like a lid, pressure building beneath. I felt hardened, the coals of any kind of feeling compressed into diamonds sharp enough to shred my insides. The doctor said it was ulcers from stress, and he gave me some tablets and instructions to take up yoga, but I took up an addiction to painkillers instead and thought about trying to find my mother and my sister. So I could ask why. But what could I say if I found them? They probably wanted me to be happy, but I was mouldering in a flat at the end of the world. I'd made nothing of myself but a black hole from which no light escaped. I went back to the airport. I bought a ticket to wherever was sunny. I didn't bother to look at the destination when I checked the gate number. I sat on a striped hotel beach towel on the sand and burned, red enough to look like I was perpetually embarrassed. I caught the next plane back to Edinburgh and stayed in bed for a week. But I got bored eventually. There's only so many times you can go over something in your mind before it starts to feel like a rut you can't see out of. And I was tired of the view. I went back to the doctor and I told him that yoga wasn't helping. He looked at me like he knew I'd never been to a class, and he referred me to a therapist who sat there and looked at me for a while. And then told me the story of Pandora's box, that tired white moth that's supposed to be hope, squashed in there under all the rest of the mess until it's suffocated and can barely move its wings to fly. I told him that my white moth was already dead, and he said, was I sure about that, and perhaps we should check, in case it wasn't. I humoured him, and he made noises in appropriate places like, and I see, and I wondered if he'd been taught that at therapist's school, or if he'd come up with it on his own. You need closure, he said. I just shrugged. You're the professional, I said. It felt like another chore on the list. Find sister, buy milk, pick up the Sunday paper. God knows why that was on the list. Or maybe he didn't know. The paper never brought me any hope. I was staring at it anyway, the train wreck that was page 3, when my phone rang, and the voice at the other end said, hello, and then it said, I have some information for you. I sat in a brown vinyl chair on the other side of a desk that looked older than I was, and tried to pay attention to the person that I'd employed to find another person, and none of it felt real as he read to me from a screen. The Venetian blinds over the windows in his office were bent and broken at one end, and I saw a red car drive down the road outside. He wrote down an email address on a green post-it note and charged me a few £100 for the privilege, and I thanked him and paid with credit and went to buy some bananas. My therapist kept asking if I'd emailed, and I kept saying no. The post-it note remained stuck to my fridge, getting more curled and faded with every month that passed. What would I say? Hello, it's your sister. What have you been doing for the last several hundred years? Me? Yeah, I'm good. I'm a black hole. You'd be proud. I don't check my actual mail. The boarding house has a stack of mailboxes, one for each room, trailing rust down the wall of the entryway. Most of them don't lock properly, and there's always an avalanche of junk mail on the floor below that every couple of months someone will get round to moving. So I wasn't thinking about mail when my next-door neighbour hammered on my door. I told her to fuck off. Whatever she wanted to borrow, I didn't have any. And she yelled back through my door that I had mail and kicked it underneath. Slammed her own door so hard the pictures on my wall rattled. I wouldn't have cared had they fallen. Insipid pastoral scenes with no personality, left over from whoever had the room before me. I rolled off my bed and picked up the envelope. It was cream, and the writing on it looked uncertain, though I couldn't have told you why I thought that. Looking at that envelope, wondering who died, made it hard to breathe. I needed a horizon, so I pulled on a coat and caught the bus to the shore. Sometimes defining moments happen to you, and you don't realise that's what they are until long after. Like the day my sister and I took the photograph to our mother and said, "Hey, who's this with Dad?" Sometimes you know ahead of time. I knew this was one as soon as that envelope slid under my door like a knife between my ribs, and it made me afraid. I tore it open. Inside was a photograph I'd never seen before, 2 gap-toothed kids grinning and squint-eyed at the sun. A folded page came with it. The letter wasn't long. I don't know what to say, it said. I want to tell you happy stories, but I think I'm a black hole. I sat on the sand and watched a ragged white moth fly into the wind. Thanks for listening. I hope that you enjoyed this story. This was a story that wrote itself. If you did enjoy it and you want more stories, perhaps you would like to become a patron. Patrons receive bonus stories and other things, and you can find out more about all of that on patreon.com/Can I Tell You a Story. Until next time, keep an eye out for the white moth.